Hello and welcome to Scattered Terrain. My name is Meredith, and today I'm going to show you how I made an encounter map for the basement of the Sanguine Temple from the module In Accordance With The Chord. Now, I was given a behind-the-scenes preview of this module while it was being developed, and I wanted to help out with the charitable cause that it was created to support. If you're interested in picking up a copy of the module, or if you'd like to learn more about the charity, click on the link in the description down below. For now, suffice it to say I picked a map I was pretty sure would be housing an epic boss battle, and I got to work.
My first step was to break down the individual pieces required to make the map. Starting with the floors, I'll need a 10-inch diameter circle for the worship chamber, 2 4x4-inch squares for the prison rooms, and then for the hall, I'm going to break it into 2 tiles, one that's 9 inches by 4 inches and one that's 3 inches by 4 inches. Working up from there, next are the walls. Now both of these rooms are the same, so we'll need 2 each of a 1 square wall and a 2 square wall. From there, all the remaining pieces are scattered terrain. The stairs, which are a spiral staircase that take up a 2x2-inch square on the map, the altar, which also takes up a 2x2-inch square. We're also going to need 2 cages. Now on the map, the cages are pictured as being quite small so that any occupants would be cramped and uncomfortable, but to increase playability, I'm going to make the cages just a little bigger. Then we're also going to need 2 stools, a barrel near the entrance, 9 statues, 7 candelabra, and a skeleton to finish it off and set the mood. Today, I'm going to focus on the stonework of the building itself. Once I had all my measurements planned out, I was ready to get started. I went to the hardware store and I got myself a 2-foot square of Owens Corning Pink Foamular, which is an XPS foam. Here's a good look at the label for anyone who's having a hard time finding foam. You could reach out to them at this website or phone number to see if they have a local distributor in your area. I'll put this information in the description down below. I started by marking out a 10.5-inch square on my foam, making a slight impression with my pencil. That way I have a bit of a groove to follow along with my hot wire cutter. I'm cutting at 10.5 inches instead of right at 10 in order to give myself a little bit of wiggle room, just in case. Once I got my guidelines drawn on, I grabbed my proxon. Here's how I usually keep it set, right below 3. Following my pencil lines, I cut out my 10.5-inch square. When cutting on a proxon, the best way to go is low and slow. If you notice your wire is bending in the direction that you're pushing your foam, you either need to slow down or turn up your heat. If you're seeing smoke from your wire, then it's too hot. Then, using my homemade circle cutter, I trimmed off my square edges, giving me a circle just over the 10-inch circle shown on the map. I like giving the outer edge of playable area a little bit of extra space to keep things from tipping off accidentally. Now, as you're slowly spinning the foam on that center pin, you also want to make sure that you have a hand on top of the foam near the wire giving a gentle downwards pressure. If the foam starts to ride up a bit, it can cause a beveled edge to occur, and you want to keep this straight up and down. So you just want to keep a hand near to that wire in order to keep your foam flat to the cutting surface. And as you reach the end of the circle, turn off the heat and keep the circle moving until that wire cools down. This keeps the wire from sticking to the foam. Then I swap my circle cutter for the flat bar guide that the proxon comes with, along with a homemade extension that I've got for cutting taller foam pieces. This helps me ensure that I get nice straight cuts. Then, using the remaining pieces of foam, I set about cutting what I need for all of the other floor tiles and walls. I'll be leaving the circle at 1 inch thick, mainly because it's too tall to fit under the arm of the proxon, but for all the other floor tiles and for the walls, you want to make sure to cut them down to 1/2 inch, or whatever height matches your normal dungeon tiles. Something to watch out for with extruded polystyrene foam is that one end can have a bend in it, so it's always a good idea just to take a look at your foam from the end and make sure that you plan around that when you're cutting. Now, as you can see here, the grid on the proxon and the arm on the guide aren't always square to each other. The important thing is to measure the distance from where the wire is to where the guide is. As long as that distance is accurate, whatever you pass through will be the right size. And once I've got all my pieces cut out, I'll just get this guy tucked out of the way. But don't put him too far, we're going to need him again in a minute. Now we're going to move on to our next step, carving the foam. Let's start with the large circle. The first thing we want to do is make a center line. So using a nice straight-edged ruler and an X-Acto blade, you're going to make a very shallow slice right down the center of the circle. Then using that center line as a guide, you're going to move your ruler over 1 inch and draw another line right next to the first line. Continue using this method until you've drawn 1-inch lines over the entire face of the circle. Now when you get to the edge and you see that if you draw that final line you would only have a tiny bit left over, that's where I stop and let that final square just be a little bit wider than the others. Once you've made all of your vertical lines, spin your circle and then line yourself up, then measure that center line and find the middle. From there, you're gonna draw your center line going in the opposite direction. Now, while you're making these lines, if you find you've accidentally wandered away from the ruler, don't worry about it. Just correct yourself back, make the line where it's supposed to be, and when we're aging this later, we can just make that look like another crack in the stone. And there again, see, we've got another happy accident that's gonna make for some beautiful aging later. Now keep in mind, I've sped my footage up a little bit. When you're cutting with an X-Acto blade, you wanna go nice and slow. And I'm only putting the blade in about 1/8 of an inch at the most. These are fairly shallow cuts. And you're gonna just use this exact same method to put a 1-inch grid across all of your floor tiles. Now for this particular map, that center hallway runs directly into the circular tile. So we're gonna need to make a cutout where the 2 tiles can nest into each other. So once you've finished drawing out your grid, we're gonna mark out which tiles need to be removed in order to have the hall tile fit in place. So it's the 4 center tiles on one side. Now we're going to take those lines that we drew on the face of the tile and continue them down over the edge. This helps to really sell the idea that these are giant stone blocks that have been put together to make the floor. You just line your X-Acto blade up with the slice and then slowly drag it down the side of the tile, making another rocking motion when you get to the bottom to bring it all the way around that final edge. And just work your way all around the outer edge of your tile, making sure that you've continued all of the lines. Just give this a final check here, make sure we're not missing any. All right, next we're gonna grab a pencil and we're going to follow all of the lines that we just made with that pencil, using the wider tip to gouge an opening. As we see here, this is the part we've marked out that we don't need to carve, so let me just flip over to the other side. And as you're drawing the vertical lines, you want to make sure that you wrap the line all the way under the bottom of the tile. That way it really does look like the corner of a stone block. In fact, let's just production line here for a minute. I'm going to go around and do the bottom of all of the lines around the circle. Oh, and it looks like I missed one here. Let me just make this line here. There we go. And then before I forget, let's just address that little slip up right here and make it look like a crack. Add a little extra branch off here. And then I approach the problem area from the other direction with my pencil to ensure that I do get one good clean line exactly where I actually want it to be. And then just follow through on the line, making sure to take it all the way over the edge. And don't forget to do the other side as well. And in fact, you know what? Let's go ahead and production line again here and just do all of the side lines at once. And since I've already started the indent on the bottom, I'm going to go ahead and draw from the bottom up on these. And now that we've drawn all the side lines, we can go ahead and just finish off all of the lines on the face. All right, and then once we've got that grid completely marked out on the circle, we're gonna bring our Proxon back so that we can remove that little inset for the hallway. Now I'm gonna go ahead and use the tile itself to line up the distance on my Proxon. While the wire is cold, I'm gonna line it up with the groove that I'm cutting to, and then just slide my guide until it touches the edge and lock it down. And then moving very carefully, I just cut out that notch. This is where having those X's on the surface of the foam really come in handy because you know exactly when you're supposed to turn. And then we're just gonna pop that out and clean up this rough edge here. That way there's nothing that keeps the hall tile from sitting snug. And then we're gonna come back with our X-Acto and put those edge lines into the newly exposed part of the tile. And just like before, we're gonna follow up with that pencil and make sure we carry our lines into the bottom. And then I'm going to take the edge of my pencil and with a little bit of pressure, I'm going to run it along this new cut edge just to soften it a bit and give it a little more of a worn look. And then we'll just give this a test fit here. Perfect fit. So then you're going to continue this exact same method with all of your other floor tiles. And I always start with that center line as opposed to starting from the edge. That way, if my measurements of cutting my tiles out wasn't quite perfect, you'll never know because the tiles all the way around are still the same distance from the edge. Now, when it comes to the walls, the process is going to be quite similar. Here, however, my first step is going to be to make the layers of bricks. I make my walls in 1-inch high sections, and I divide that inch into 3 brick layers. So I start by marking my brick layers on the edges, and then I connect the 2 edge lines together across the center. That way I'm sure my points will line up. And make sure you do this both front and back. And just as before with the floor tiles, we're not cutting very deeply into the foam here. At the most, it's 1/8 of an inch. If you cut too deep, you might accidentally cut all the way through the foam, and you don't want that. Once you've got your layer lines in place, it's time to draw the individual bricks. I like to do my bricks in 1/2-inch lengths. That way everything lines up to the grid quite nicely. So for the top and bottom, I mark out that 1/2-inch line, and then I carry it around to either side down to the first layer. I find it really helps to cut a straight line if you lay your X-Acto blade into the slice that you made on the top, and then use a gentle rocking motion to guide your blade down the front of the brick until it lines up with that line. And then for the middle layer of bricks, I'm gonna eyeball it and draw the dividing lines roughly halfway between my other bricks. It's all right if your lines aren't perfect with this. These bricks would have all been made by hand anyway, so there's gonna be some natural variations. And follow this exact same process with the longer walls. You're just gonna mark out your 1/2-inch lengths all across the top and bottom. Carry those lines down the face of the bricks. And then mark out your lines roughly halfway between each brick on that middle layer. And then just like we did with the floors, you're gonna grab your pencil and follow all the slices that you just made, widening the grooves. Give these guys a quick once over, make sure that we're not missing any lines here, and do the exact same thing across all of your wall segments. Now that we've got all of our foam cut out and marked, let's do a quick test fit and make sure that everything looks and fits the way we're expecting it to. All right, and it looks like we are spot on and ready to move on to our next step, texture. To make our stone texture, we're going to use a ball of aluminum foil. Now, when I'm preparing my aluminum foil texture ball, I like to make sure that I crumple the whole sheet up just a little bit all the way across before I start rolling it, and that helps guarantee that I have a little more uniform of a texture. And then you want to just pack it down into a ball until it doesn't give when you squeeze it. And when we press this into our foam, it will give us a very organic rock texture. There are a lot of different ways that you can get this kind of a texture, including just pressing actual rocks into your foam. So whatever you've got handy that you think might work, go ahead and give it a try. I actually took the aluminum ball one step further, and I hot glued some crumpled aluminum foil to a wooden dowel. This way I can texture large sections of floor at once with sort of a rolling pin. So you're just gonna lay out all of your floor sections, and with a nice steady pressure, I'm gonna roll my textured rolling pin right over the surface. If you're just using an aluminum foil ball, you would just press the ball all over every surface area. And then I'm gonna switch over to the aluminum foil ball in order to texture the edges here. And you wanna make sure that you're rolling the ball between your fingers as you go so that you're not using the same side everywhere. If you use the same side everywhere, people could start to see a pattern develop, and you wanna keep it as random and natural as possible. Now, when the time comes to make the edges textured, I find that it really helps to stack tiles together when they're the same size. That way you can texture multiple sides at once. They also help give each other strength so that while you're doing this, you have less of a chance of accidentally snapping off any pieces. You do want to be a little careful when you're texturing foam because it is quite fragile and you can snap it. And just double check here, make sure that we've textured all the sides. All right, and then the next step is to add some cracks to the stone. So I'm gonna grab that pencil and I'm just gonna draw some cracks onto the stone face here. And you know, it doesn't look like this quite has enough texture. Let me just hit this a little bit more. There we go. And so then I'm just gonna take a look at the foam and see if I see any places that I want to put some age. I think this crack I'm gonna have start off the tile and wrap up over the edge. Another way that you can add age to the tiles is to chip little pieces off with your X-Acto blade. You want to hold it at a very slight angle and then just sort of shave little bits off of the stone. This gives a very nice chipping effect. I really like doing it around the edges, and if you bring it towards a crack and stop when you get to the divide between stones, it really helps to sell that they're separate pieces. Now, the module describes this temple as having been abandoned for a long time, so I'm going to go a little heavier with my aging on these tiles than I might otherwise. Even so, I don't want to go too far overboard. So let's take a look here and see. I think it could use just a little bit more here. And up here it looks pretty clean, so I'm just going to take a little bit out of this piece. Let's take a look. All right, yeah, I'm happy with that. I'd say that looks like a good old worn temple floor. And so you're just going to go through all of your foam tiles and give them this same aging process, drawing in cracks anywhere that you think it looks like there should be one, and chipping away stone where you think it makes sense. Now for the cutout on the big circle, the aluminum foil ball isn't going to fit into those corners. For situations like this, I've made some texturing tools. I took some green stuff and I rolled it onto the end of a pencil and then formed it down into a cone shape. Then before it dried, I rolled it in train ballast, and it makes an excellent texture tool that I can get into a much tighter space. So I'm going to just roll this texture all over the inside of that cutout. And in order to keep the piece looking nice and uniform, I'm going to go ahead and use that same texturing tool to do all of the edges for this tile. And then I'm also going to take it and just put a couple of sections of this texture onto the face of the tile as well. That way it really blends everything together. And then I'm actually going to take my other texturing tool that uses a slightly larger grade of ballast and in just a few places press some additional texture in. That way my texturing isn't too uniform all the way around and I have a little bit more natural variation. And that means I'm going to press it into a few places onto the face of the tile as well, just to really make sure that we have the same kind of texture a little bit everywhere. And I really like the variation that this is giving me, and I want to make sure all of my tiles go together, so I'm going to grab all of my other floor tiles and use this guy to give a little bit of texture to all of them as well. All right, look at all that lovely aged texture. And one thing that you want to keep in mind when you're aging and damaging these tiles is that in the very center of this big circular piece, there's going to be a large blood glyph painted. So when you're adding your cracks and damage, you don't want too much right in the center where that design's going to be, but you also don't want to avoid it entirely. So I'm going to put a little crack here in the center where I don't think it's going to get in the way of the design too much, but it'll keep it from having a big blank space that stands out as being obviously different. And when you do any cracks on tiles that are near the edge, you want to make sure to carry those cracks over the edge and down around any corners. That really helps to sell it's an actual stone that's been cracked. And if you've got any places that you look at and think look like it's a factory cut or something that's just a little bit too unnatural, go ahead and cover it up with some damage. And look at that, what was once a vertical line in the foam is now just another old crack in the stonework. All right, let's give this a good once over, see if we're happy with it. Yeah, I think that's enough cracks. Time to do some chipping. So just give it a good once over all around, chipping out some edges to the tiles. A couple of corners off of some of the face tiles. And just the general wear and tear of a few centuries passing by. And I think this area down here needs just a little more. So using the flat of my blade, I'm just gonna dig a little crevice right into this piece. And then just pick off any little bits with your finger. All right, I'd say I've got a pretty good aged stone floor. Time to move on to our next step. Just clean up your little foam shavings here. And make sure you don't forget to texture and age all of your wall pieces. You also want to make sure to take that aluminum foil ball and hit the edges of the pieces so that they don't have that factory foam perfect line. Just rough it up a little bit. And give a light touch to the corners. And you just want to repeat that same texturing process with all of the floor and wall tiles for the map. And once all of your stonework is textured and aged, it's time to move on to a nice protective coating of Mod Podge. So grab your bottle of Mod Podge and a damp brush, and just give all of your foam pieces a good thorough going over. Now you don't want to make this too thick a coating because you don't want to obscure all that beautiful texture that you just put on, but you do want to make sure that you give it a good coating to keep it safe. This really helps prevent any further damage or dings from getting into the foam. Now sometimes I will mix paint into my Mod Podge in order to have my base coat and my Mod Podge in one step, but right now the only color I have mixed in is black, and I don't want to go that dark with my base coat for this project. I like to do my Mod Podging in 2 steps. I'll do 2 sides and the front of all of my pieces, and then I'll go back and do the remaining 2 sides and the back of all of my pieces. That way each side's able to get nice and dry before I flip it over. And then once your Mod Podge layer is dry, it's time to move on to the base coat. Now the module describes the Sanguine Temple as a partially collapsed alabaster and marble structure. So I'll be using raw umber for the base coat on these. So I'll just grab my fancy palette, get a little bit of that raw umber, grab my damp brush, and give all of my floor and wall tiles a good base coat. Now once that first base coat dries, if you can still see your foam through it, go ahead and give it another layer. And once again, you want to make sure that you get all 4 sides of your wall tiles. And I like to do the underside of my floor tiles with the base coat too. That way if for any reason one of the tiles gets flipped over at the table, you don't have that pink foam showing through. Once you've got a good solid base coat and it's completely dry, it's time for dry brushing. Now in order to get that aged marble alabaster look, I'm going to be dry brushing with light mocha. Now whenever I dry brush something, I always like to start on the bottom of the piece for the first couple of swipes, just to make sure I have the amount of paint on my brush that I think I do. If I have too much paint or not enough paint, the underside of a tile is really the best place to find that out. And then this first dry brushing step is really more of an over brushing than a dry brushing, as you want to go pretty heavy with this. And so just make sure that you go over all 4 faces of your walls and all of your floor tiles. Now for the same reason that I put the base coat on the underside of my floor tiles, I'm going to go ahead and give them a quick once over with this overbrushing step as well. And then once that overbrushing is completely dry, we're going to move on to our wash. For the wash on this build, I'm using a burnt sienna craft paint, and I mix it with water in a 1 part paint to 10 parts water ratio. You don't need it to be that exactly, but you want roughly that amount so that you get a good amount of color without it being overpowering. So just using that same base coating brush, you're going to give a nice once over to all of your pieces with this wash. You don't want to go too heavy and let it pool up too much. You just want to sort of give everything a nice tinting with this burnt umber color. Now with the wash, I don't worry about doing the underside of any of my floor tiles, but you do want to make sure to get all 4 sides of those wall tiles. Now with the wash, I like to follow the same process that I do with the Mod Podge and do the top and sides of my piece and then circle back and do the bottom after the top has had a little bit of time to dry. And just make sure that you cover all of your floor and wall pieces with that wash. Once the wash is dry, it's time to do our final dry brushing. So we're going to go back to that same light mocha color, but this time our dry brushing is going to be very, very light. So I'm going to go ahead and give it a test run in the palm of my hand here to make sure that I have just a little bit of color on my brush. And then I'm going to gently go over all of the exposed surfaces of my stonework. Now when you're noticing that you're starting to push much harder to keep going, that's when it's time to reload your brush. Just make sure before you put that freshly loaded brush back onto your piece that you test it on your hand or on the bottom of something first. When you've been running out of paint on your brush for a while, that first bit that you've loaded up fresh, you don't need to push nearly so hard. So you want to make sure to remind yourself to start taking it easy every time you reload. Now let's just take a quick look here with one of the tiles I haven't done yet and see what a difference this dry brushing really makes. Once you finish dry brushing all of your stonework, it's time for the final step on the floors, and that's going to be freehanding that blood glyph ritual symbol into the center of the worship chamber. Now I wanted to match the blood glyph that had been drawn in the module specifically, so I pulled up the PDF, took a screen grab of just that center sigil, and scaled it up to be just about the right size. Now I'm going to take a look at this and pick out some key points that I can use to make freehand drawing this much easier. This particular section of the blood circle happens to line up with the halfway point of the tile, and it does this on all 4 sides. The next thing that jumps out at me is this center circle. It's almost exactly a ½ inch across, which means that it's about 1/4 of an inch off each side of that center line. The next point I'm going to use to help me freehand this out are these corner crossings. Now you can see the circle crosses directly over each of these 4 points. Then if we look at the square that has the small circle and draw a line dividing it in half, we see the distance from this circle to that halfway line is the same as the distance from this circle to the other sides of the tile. For the squares that have the large circle, if we draw that same dividing line, we can see the circle actually touches the halfway point there, just as it touches the sides of the square. And where it touches the side of each square is just about at that square's halfway point. Then I want to make sure that I compare my reference here with the actual map, and make sure that I know where that entrance hallway comes in. To paint my blood circle, I'm going to use this red brick craft paint. It's red enough that you'll know right away that it's blood, but there's enough brown mixed in to let you know that this isn't really fresh. And I'm going to start off using my fine detail brush. So I'm going to count out my squares and make sure that I'm at the center of my tile. And then using that reference photo I drew up, I'm going to go ahead and make my first marks of where my circle's going to be. Now I'm using my fine detail brush and just putting little dots of color at this point. That way, if as I'm going along I realize I've made a mistake, it can just be seen as little droplets of blood that are outside of the design, and it won't be a problem. So starting with that inner circle, I'm going to go about 1/4 of an inch out from the center point in all 4 directions and make a little red line. Then I'm just going to draw smooth curves between the lines to make myself a circle. Then from there I'll go out to my next reference point, which was halfway through these tiles, and those 4 corner crossing points. And once I've got all of my guide markings drawn out, then I just make a little dotted line connecting point to point until I've roughed out a basic circle shape with that fine tipped brush. Then once you've got your basics roughed in with the fine tip brush, you're going to swap out for a larger brush, and using a dabbing, tapping motion, you're going to go ahead and fill in a thicker line following your guidelines. Then it's back to the detail brush to put in my next reference marks, and I'm going to go ahead and make the small circles and the large circles using the information from my printout to put in my guiding dots. And once my guidelines are in place, I switch back to the large brush and fill them in. And with freehanding the curve, it's the same thing. I'm just using that fine tip brush and working from my reference photo, picking where it starts and stops along the edge, and then playing connect the dots between the two. Anywhere that it crosses where floor tiles meet, I can also use that as a good guide mark. And then you also want to put in a rough guideline, giving you a distance between your inner and outer circles. Then switch back to your bigger brush, and again using that tapping, dragging motion, just work all of your guidelines bigger. And remember, it doesn't have to be perfect. This blood sigil was sponged onto the floor by, well, read the module and you'll find out who, but chances are they weren't able to draw perfect circles either. Now as you're going along, if you find that you've put some paint somewhere that you don't want it, Act quickly, rinse your brush out with some clean water, and then use that damp brush to sponge up the paint from the area that you don't want it. You might have to rinse your brush out a few times while you're doing this, but if you work quickly, you can go ahead and get that cleaned back off. And I save that final outer circle for last just to make sure that you don't accidentally rest your hand on it while you're working the rest of the design. And once that outer circle is finished, your design is done and you could go ahead and call it a day here. But you know, I want to add a little bit more detail to this. So I'm going to grab my fine detail brush and I'm going to water down some of this red paint, and I'm just going to fill into some of these crevices that the blood has run off and is draining out the cracks in the floor. This step is completely optional and over the top, but I really like the effect that I got with it. And if I give that a quick comparison to my reference here, yeah, looks good. Now that we've got all of our floors and walls ready, I'm going to finish off today's video with our accent skeleton. So I grabbed my box of miniature skeletons from War Games Atlantic. Not a sponsor, I just really like their skeletons. And I glued the pieces together in a way that I felt fit the scene I was trying to set. So I took my skeleton outside and I gave him a quick base coat with a black spray paint, and then I gave him a zenithal prime with a highlight of white from above at about a 45-degree angle from all four sides. That gives me a really nice range of highlights to shadows all over. And then to finish him off, I just grab my sepia wash and give him a good coating all over. Just want to make sure that there's no area that you don't touch with the wash, because it will stand out pretty bright white if you don't hit it. Now, a word of warning when you're shedding your Citadel shades, really make sure that you close this until it clicks, because if it's not sealed all the way, the water will evaporate out and your shade will start getting much darker very quickly. Then just take your brush with the remaining wash that's on it and give him a quick once over. Make sure that the shade is pooling where you want it to in those crevices. All right, and once everything's dry, let's put all this together and take a look at how adding the additional scatter really helps set the scene. As the sun begins to set, you make your way down the stairs to what lies beneath. The hall is long, a pair of statues standing sentinel in the dim light. Moving ever deeper, you pass rooms holding cages that are cold and comfortless. Coming at last to the large central chamber, a grisly scene awaits. Floor-standing candelabra are shadowed by menacing statues. In the very center of the room, you see a large, bloody pattern painting a vile sigil onto the floor before the altar. The skeletal remains of last night's victim still sprawled across its curving design.
And so there you have it, the basement of the Sanguine Temple from In Accordance With The Chord, The Malice of Acardia. Now that we have the base map to build off of, over the next several videos I'm going to show you how to make each individual piece of scatter, starting with the staircase. Stick around.
Thanks for spending some of your time here with me at Scattered Terrain. If you liked that video, hit the like button. If you want to see more, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you next time.